And we have an Argentinian on our panel. So anyway, so all right. So what we're gonna do today, what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna get started. And so my name is Geert Dhondt, and I'll talk a few things about myself while you're getting settled. I'm a professor at John Jay College at the City University of New York, and inspiring Ingrid yesterday, I should say that we have a fantastic master's program, an undergraduate program in the critique of political economy, Ricardo. So where we place Marx very central in our curriculum. And as you could see in the build-up of the panels this weekend, yesterday it started about what is kind of heterodox economics, and then it started talking about, well, Marx and the study of political economy of Marx is central to heterodox economics, and then we get today to this panel right now about austerity and inflation, two of the most important crises that we're facing and concepts that we're dealing with today. And so I'm not going to say that much further. We have a lot of people on our panel, and Clara is going to talk first about inflation, austerity, and conflict.
Let me track my time. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I would first like to thank especially Clara for the invitation, but also the whole Che group for making this event, and of course University of Tulsa for having us and for having Che, which is a really exciting center coming up. My name is Clara Brenck. I am a professor at the University of Minas Gerais and also a research associate at the Research Center of Macroeconomics of Inequalities from the University of São Paulo. I'm also a member of a very recent group that we just started. It's called Remodela, and it's made of 6 women macroeconomists, and we're very exciting to discuss exactly monetary policy issues. So I think this is exactly some of the ideas that we were discussing in that group that I want to bring here. So, of course, we're going to talk about inflation, austerity, and conflict. And from there, I think we should start saying that inflation is conflict, right? So, going against the mainstream idea that inflation is because of excess demand, we know that inflation is conflict, and inflation happens when capitalists and workers are not happy with their share of income. So they're going to bargain and try to get a higher share, higher wages, and then capitalists will not accept lower profits and then pass that to prices, and we have conflict. So within this conflict, the mainstream agenda solves this conflict in one side, and we know whose side it is. So I remember when I saw this news in 2023 that the Bank of England economists says, well, people should just accept that they are poor, or someone needs to accept that they are worse off. And of course, we know who needs to accept they are worse off. It's not capitalists, it's workers, right? So the solution within the neoclassical, it's, well, we hike interest rates, and then we increase unemployment, we lower bargaining powers of workers, and then they just need to accept that they're worse off, right? What I want to bring here, I'm not going to talk much about that, inflation and conflict, but I want to bring a connection with fiscal austerity within this side. So yes, we know workers are going to be worse off when we increase interest rates because that's going to increase unemployment, but there's also a side on the fiscal policy that I think we need to always be aware of. So it's the only equation, I promise, but it's just the evolution of the public debt to GDP. So if we just look at the change of the public debt to GDP, that depends on 2 things. First, how public debt is growing, which will depend on the interest rates are, and on the primary surplus, so how much we're spending, how much we have as a revenue from taxes, and of the growth rates, because that's the denominator, right? So if we are in a balanced budget, so whatever we get as revenues, we pay as taxes, the debt to GDP ratio can be stable if interest rates are equal to growth rates. But of course, in the setting of inflation, where we have an increase in interest rates, because this is what the inflation targeting regime tells us, so we have an inflation targeting, we have inflation, and then we increase interest rates to stabilize this debt to GDP ratio, we need to either have very high growth rates or to have a primary surplus, right? This might not seem a problem if we do have very low interest rates, so we're close to the zero lower bound, for example, or interest rates very low and we're going from 1 to 3% interest rates. Okay, we have a growth rate of around 3%, 2%, that's not a big problem. But this is only true if we are in a developed world. So if you have a strong currency, you can sustain lower interest rates, for example, and etc. But if you are in a developing economy, you cannot do that because then our currency is not too strong, and then this will lead to the need of austerity in the fiscal side because then interest rates are going to be much higher, right? So I bring Brazil as an example, not only because I'm from Brazil, but also because we have the second highest interest rate in the world, and this is a big problem there. Which of course becomes a political problem, as I'm gonna talk right now. So this is our basic rate of interest over time, and I don't know if you can see, I think you can, that's 14%. So right now we have an interest rate equal to 13.25%, and the central bank is planning to increase to 14.25 next month. So yes. This is a very high interest rate, and then why? Well, we're having an increase in inflation. Why? Our inflation is very connected also to the exchange rate. So we have a devaluation in the exchange rate. Why? Well, because the government announced a more progressive tax policy to tax the rich, for example, and of course that meant that we had a fiscal problem. And then what we see in the news in the beginning of this year, it's saying, well, debt is growing 12.2% last year. And I mean, of course, interest rates are 13%, and that remunerates great part of our public debt. So that becomes a discourse that kind of reinforces itself because, well, debt is growing, so we need to have austerity, which would then lower growth, and then we have all the other problems connecting to inflation and high interest rates because then we have more risk premium on the public debt and etc., and that kind of reinforces itself. So I think this is where we should start like discussing and fighting the argument, right? So of course, this is kind of the logic that comes behind the inflation targeting regime, which leads to fiscal austerity, which of course, in the case of Brazil, it's much more serious because of our super high interest rate, but I think it applies to other economies as well, as we are just coming from that basic equation, which is a motion equation. It has no behavior behind it. So I think the thing is, well, how do we go from here, right? What do we challenge? And I think, of course, there are many things that we have to challenge. The first is the notion that inflation is demand-led. Of course, we know inflation is not, and we have to challenge that discourse. But I also think that, and this is what led us in Remodela to come together and discuss monetary policy issues, which is bring exactly the income distribution, not only to the inflation as conflict, but also to the instruments and to the policy itself. So we know interest rates affect growth rates, like directly. If you increase interest rates, you lower growth rates, you increase unemployment, and that's basically how you solve the conflict of inflation. But we also know that interest rates affect directly the income distribution or indirectly depending on the channels. And I think this is kind of where we should also discuss. So this model of having the interest rates in inflation targeting, it's not neutral, of course, in terms of distribution, and we know that, and that not only impacts inflation, but itself the growth rate of the economy. So the whole macroeconomy needs to pay attention to this. And even though we have some discussion on this link between interest rates and income distribution, I do think that we need to think more about that. So how is that impacting? How are we making policy that controls for that or that tries to alleviate the impact on income distribution? Is that impact the same depending on whatever is happening to the exchange rate or whatever is happening to other monetary variables that matter for us? So this is exactly the link that we think that we should be working more together and to think on heterodox approaches to fight the basic inflation targeting discourse and then get finally to policy, because I think that, as was mentioned before, yesterday especially a lot, I think we need to get to policy and not stay only on the academic discussion. And this is something that we try to do a lot at MAGI, the research center. So we really try to translate the discourse so we have more discussion with the public and get, to news and it actually affect the public policy. So I think that one thing we need to ask ourselves is how much do we need to change from whatever is going on? And I think that we'll have several different answers as we were discussing here. Someone will say we have to change everything. Someone, we have within post-Keynesians ideas that, well, inflation targeting is compatible with an economy, a post-Keynesian economy, for example. We just need to adjust the target. The target may not be inflation. It can be unemployment or something like this. So I think that this is a first question that we want to ask. If we say, well, we cannot think about a setting and we need to think about something that's breaking with the inflation targeting, so what are we bringing as an alternative? I think there are out there some proposals, but I still think that we need to discuss much, much more on this, and I didn't want to, also because I don't have much time, but I didn't want to bring all the proposals here, but I think that being inauguration of a research center like this, I think I wanted to end the presentation with the open questions to invite for the discussion on what do we do with this model that's out there and leads to this circular, austerity, inflation targeting kind of regime. How do we get out of this? Where do we start? And what do we do in terms of active policy, of course, based on our academic models. So that's all. I planned to speak for only 10 minutes, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. Next up is Costas, an important economist from SOAS.
Hello. It's a real pleasure to be here and meet people I haven't seen in a long time and others who I see quite often. I haven't got much time, so I'll get cracking. We're going to go at 100 miles an hour. I was asked to talk about inflation and austerity. I don't really have much to say about inflation per se. All I would say is that my understanding of the reawakening of goods price inflation since 2020, 2021 has to do with the balance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply and the weakness of supply in particular. The emphasis should not be on demand, it should be on supply. The weakness of supply is of critical importance, and that is really what radical Marxist political economy can contribute from now on. Obviously, monetarism doesn't work, and clearly enterprise speculation The markups and so on are very important, but they're not the beginning. If enterprises could play with the markup, they would do it every time. If we have inflation, if you've got a bout of inflation, it has to do with how the system as a whole worked. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, as I said, and a component of aggregate demand here, which also affects the supply, but I haven't got time to go into that, has to do with monetary policy. So I'm going to talk about monetary policy here and central banking. This is a paper that I've done with a young colleague of mine. He focuses on the European Central Bank, but I will generalize. And if I have time, I will tell you specifically what holds for the European Central Bank. Now, inflation as a story here is related to quantitative easing and the monetary policies that the main central banks of the world adopted since the great crisis of 2007-2009, basically, the unorthodox monetary policies, obviously. I'm going to make 4 points then as we move along. Quantitative easing stops in 2022 as inflation picks up. Quantitative tightening follows, but quantitative tightening is not symmetric to quantitative easing. And the lack of symmetry is of great importance. It's not the opposite, and it cannot be. Point number 2, the money markets, the main money markets of the world and the central banks, the chief central banks, are in an unprecedented engagement with each other historically. Contemporary capitalism has to do with that. It's very important to understand it from the perspective of Marxist political economy. This engagement, point number 3, is a characteristic of what I and colleagues of mine have called the interregnum since 2007-2009. The 15 years that have passed since then, in which obviously something is happening, but it can't quite decide what it is going to be. Trump is an indication of that. And the mixture of policies he follows, the attack on so many things without a clear purpose, or maybe there's a purpose underneath which he doesn't know either. That's an indicative element of the interregnum. The relationship between the central bank and the money market is characteristic of the interregnum. It holds in most developed capitalist countries, and it's very important to look at it closely. It's a structural disturbance of contemporary capitalism. The last point I will make, if I've got time, is that in Europe, in addition to all that, the money market is fragmented, structurally fragmented. So the European Central Bank is in a different position to the Fed. It follows a similar path, but it's in a different position to the Fed because it's confronted with a structurally fragmented money market. And what it attempts to do is to paper over the cracks. And as it does that, it makes everything worse in the longer term. If I've got time, I'll explain that too. I've only got 15 minutes. Now, most of what I will say empirically, there is empirical work, but I haven't got time to bring it up, relates to the ECB. I will be referring to the ECB, the European Central Bank, but truly that's the Euro system. For those of you who are familiar with how Europe and its monetary system works, you will understand what I mean. A structure of national central banks connected to each other with the European Central Bank in the middle. It holds for other central banks too, though. So if we look at the performance of the European Central Bank and its balance sheet, because the balance sheet is both an instrument and a record when it comes to central banking, we will see an enormous expansion on the asset side. It would never have been predicted or allowed by the people who created the European Central Bank, and it's not in the statutes. So you will see an enormous expansion that makes it look like the Fed, which it never did 15 years ago. Most of the expansion on the asset side is through two things. Refinancing loans, which are basically repos, and they grew enormously. And second, securities holdings, public securities holdings, the essence of quantitative easing, basically. Now, clearly, balance sheet dictates that. If the asset side expands in this way, then the liability side will also expand. And the expansion on the liability side is basically two components again. Banknotes, which people often forget, because it's not sexy to talk about banknotes. Let me tell you, banknotes are very heavily used, and they're very, very important as a liability by the central bank. They've grown enormously substantially in Europe as well as in the United States. Second component is, of course, bank reserves, deposits of commercial banks with the central bank, the main element on the liability side. Both banknotes and bank reserves are essentially fiat money. So the modern fiat money. So basically what we're talking about, when we look at the balance sheet, which I repeat is a tool and a record, is in a sense the trajectory of contemporary advanced capitalism, which is expand public debt, create the securities, and the state becomes enormously indebted. Expand central bank assets, ECB assets, by buying the securities, and then of course monetize the securities by creating liabilities on the other side. The main mechanism for supporting a monetary boost to aggregate demand, as I've explained before. Now, of course, we can spend more time on this. If I had time, I would have done it, because obviously foreign debt will also increase, which is important for the United States. The balance of trade deficit will be connected to that, and there will be a massive capital inflow in the case of the United States, and the strength of the dollar, which completely disturbs the internal stability of aggregate supply in the United States, manufacturing and so on. But we haven't got time to go into that. I'll just concentrate on the central bank. Since 2022, as I've said, we've got a reversal. So what's the reversal? How does it happen? It's interesting to see how it happens. It's not symmetric. So what happens is central banks, and this holds for the European Central Bank as much as it does for the Fed, compress refinancing loans. They compress the repos, basically, right? And they compress the repos by basically not renewing them as they mature. So they compress the repos, but they keep the securities holdings very high. The securities holdings have effectively not been reduced. Actually, in Europe, they've edged up a bit. This reflects what I mentioned before, the engulfing of the money market by the central bank. The central bank is gigantic. It's a behemoth sitting in the middle of the financial system, and that is reflected, as I said before, right now in quantitative tightening in the holding of the vast securities holdings. Why is that? As I will explain in a minute, because commercial banks are now habituated. They're like drug addicts. They're habituated to liquidity provision by the central bank. It's impossible, it's very, very difficult for them to begin to function with a significant degree of independence from the central bank. That's exactly the structural dysfunctioning that I mentioned before. In addition to that, the ECB has got additional extra problems because of the fragmentation of the market, but I haven't got time to do that. How to grasp this theoretically now? Here I believe that Marxist political economy has a gigantic advantage compared to most other theories, since we're talking about Marxism. I draw my insights from the Uno tradition in Japan, which is the most advanced type of Marxist analysis of finance that I'm aware of, and I pretty much read most of them. Now, in what way? Hierarchy of money is an old thing in Marxism, which has become widely understood now by post-Keynesians and others, and they think they've discovered it, which often happens. What is also present in Marxist monetary theory and theory of finance is hierarchy of credit. And post-Keynesianism has not yet caught on to that, because the hierarchy of money is impossible to explain without the hierarchy of credit. It's actually hierarchy of credit that one begins with. And the hierarchy of credit in the Uno tradition is often called a pyramid. And basically you go trade credit, trade credit, banking credit, money market credit, central banking credit. Money market credit in this is a fundamental element of the credit hierarchy. It's what makes the credit system work. It's where banks meet with each other and transact liquidity, spare reserves. It's where the rate of interest is worked out commercially. That's the beating heart of the credit system. The central bank belongs to the money market. It's indigenous to the money market. It's the biggest bank in the money market. Its credit is the best in the system. It's a higher grade credit compared to the others for reasons that I can't go into. That's where repos belong. People are obsessed with repos, right? Repos are just the way in which it happens. It happens now. This practice is as old as the trees when it comes to capitalism. Now, how does the central bank work? By being in the money market, it has to predict the flow of incoming loanable money capital, not fictitious capital. Carolina, it's very, very important. Fictitious capital is very important, but it's fictitious, right? Loanable money capital is very real. There's nothing fictitious about loanable money capital. And the central bank has to predict the inflow of loanable money capital. That's usually in short supply every day. The central bank estimates what that will be. We are. Don't be fooled by the relative calm. They don't really know what to do. They don't know what to do because the central bank continues to engulf the money market. That's the dysfunctionality of the situation of the interregnum. Any attempt to offload the securities they hold will lead to chaos. It will be disaster because the price will collapse, the state will not be able to borrow, and the banks might themselves go bankrupt in terms of what they hold. And so what they've done is slowly to reduce refinancing, which I mentioned before. In other words, compress the refinancing, but keep the high level of securities, hoping that something will turn up. This is Mr. Bikober in monetary policy. That's what the central banks are doing at the moment. Something will turn up. I don't know what will turn up. No one does. What I do know is the current situation is untenable. This cannot be maintained indefinitely, and this is precisely the result of the dysfunctionality of the financial system as it has emerged after 2007-2009. And it's a good time that Marxists began to look at it more closely, because that's going to be the next chapter in the instability ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Costas. Next up is Matias from Bucknell University.
Okay. So I follow the important economists from SOAS. I'm an unimportant economist from somewhere in Pennsylvania, in the middle of Pennsylvania. So first of all, I want to thank Clara and Scott and Bruno and Jisoo. Yes, thank you. Yes. For the invitation, for the organization, all the stuff that you've done, to organize all of this. I was going to talk fundamentally about inflation, and I had a PowerPoint, but I decided that the PowerPoint is probably besides the point, and it was perhaps too technical. So, somebody, he know that I was born in Argentina. My family left in a year before the coup, so I grew up in Brazil. I'm more Brazilian than Argentinian, but just to be annoying, I'm going to cite Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, that he didn't write novels. He said he only wrote short stories, and the reason to write short stories was that you can always give the same story in 500 pages or in 500 words. So in a sense, and he did it well. I'm not going to do it well. I'm going to be a very poor, sort of describer of what I want to do about inflation. But I thought that given the conference and the role of Che, which nobody said, I had in my PowerPoint, by the way, it's the only reason I really regret not using the PowerPoint, is that I had a photo of Che Guevara. But fair enough. Nobody, it's the... And by the way, major mistake with your little, the lighter, the lighthouse. You should have. Somebody said, I think Clara said that you should have the, Che's beret, or something like that. We
did that at the beginning, but it looked too communist. So
no, I see with your president that could have been an issue. So I'll shut up. At any rate, I already lost most of my time. So what I want to talk a little bit is about three things I want to say. On the one hand, I want to say something about heterodoxy. What is heterodox economics and why we're here and what we do. And what I want to say essentially is that heterodox communities are essentially here for the reproduction of the heterodox community. So that's our role here. And that's an important thing to do. In the middle of what we are, which is a fundamental defeat. I think Ricardo said it in a way that he was here for the two relevant crises that we've lived, and this, I think, the 2008 crisis and how we reacted to it, which was a failure. And the left had, and progressives and heterodox people had some possibility of doing something in many places, including Latin America and Brazil, where I grew up, and certainly in Argentina. We failed, and so this is reckoning with the wreckage and with the defeat, and I think that that's what we have to think about. So an heterodox center is a place to survive, the long winter that is coming. I want to talk a little bit about inflation, so I'm going to have a little core there if I can, do it. And if I have time, I'm going to say something about Argentina and Brazil in order to illustrate some of, the relevance of heterodox economics to discuss inflation and to discuss the realities of certain countries. Actually, I think it was Ingrid, when she was a graduate student at the New School, that invited me to the New School, and when I said, that heterodox, why the New School was there, and I think Che, in many ways, and the department at Tulsa played that same role. It's the production of heterodox economists by means of heterodox economists. So that's what we're doing, and heterodoxy, in my view, I'm going to be neo-Ricardian, not Ricardo, David Ricardo. I'm referring to Riccardo Bellofiore here, who talked before and said that that economics, political economy, properly called, is scientific economics, and and in my way of defining it, and I don't mean to be I don't want to be dogmatic, and I say those two principles in a very broad sort of understanding of them. So one is that we think, heterodox people have to, one thing, think of distribution as conflictive. So that comes in very different forms for different groups. Some of us think in terms of prices of production. Prices of production come in many flavors, from some Marxist traditions to Straffian to some think in terms of markups. I have my own views on that. I'll shut up. Nobody wants to know that, and it's probably going to create more conflict than it should. And we should, by the way, we should be fragmented. I have no problem with that. I'll say something about that in a second. The second important thing is that we have to believe that output is demand determined. And so that, what really limits our ability to grow beyond the things that Jamie was talking yesterday, we live in an entropic world and whatnot, it's, in fact, we can grow more than, and we can wreck the planet because we can grow very fast if we decide to, because we can push demand. It's politics. That's why it's political economy. That's why you cannot sort of get rid of that. So there is a sort of an important element in that. And again, there are many different theories of how you sort of think about the instability that's provoked in capitalist societies because of the way of and how you formalize those things. So those things are important. As I said, there are many schools, many divisions, many sort of things in that. In the way I think, and Nicholas, which I don't know if he's in the room, but he presented this morning, he said, he's there. He said something that I think it's absolutely correct. We are orthodox in a way. So the whole point of heterodox economics is that we go back to classical political economy, and go back to the most, Straffa would say, the most advanced version of that, which was Marx. That's the name of the game. It's building up on that tradition. So we are fragmented by definition, and that's not a problem. The mainstream is very fragmented. The notion that there is a monolithic, sort of theory that we are sort of contesting is somewhat incorrect too. They're very fragmented. They are in doubt and in crisis. So I think that should be taken into consideration. I'll try. I don't have enough time, so I'm going to say something about inflation. So the views of inflation, so how inflation is understood in the heterodox arena, comes from that tradition, okay? So the very first debate in economics, relevant debate, it's between Bullionists and anti-Bullionists. It's between Mr. Ricardo, who was a classical, and somebody said it this morning, Marx says about him in a footnote, his love of truth. It's about the chapter on machinery. It's absolutely, scientific in the sense that he is the one that gives foundation to the idea of class conflict, which is in the title of this panel. He is the one that says that capital and labor are in conflict, and Marx liked that. And so he is the one that is for the idea that what caused inflation in England is the Bank of England printing too much money. And on the other hand, you have another classical author, Thomas Tuck, from where Marx says when he passes that one of the last, great classical authors has passed. Tuck is to say, no, inflation was caused by, high price of, corn because of bad, crops, and the embargo of Mr. Napoleon. That's what caused higher costs, and that's what's causing inflation. So the debates have been, and one has endogenous money, the other has exogenous money. Those things are with us. What brings inflation to what Clara told us? Inflation is conflict. It's one person that is central to all of our endeavors in many ways, Joan Robinson. Joan Robinson, in her review of a book by an Italian author called Costantino Bresciano Turroni, on the theories of inflation and the German hyperinflation, she points out that there are two theories. One that suggests that inflation in Germany was caused by the excessive printing of the Reichsbank and the financing of the deficits, the Allied school. And the other is the balance of payment school, the German balance of payment school, a guy called Hofrich. And the two theories is one is inflation is caused by printing money and deficits and excess demand, and the other is caused by depreciation of the German currency that increases the price of imported goods and forces a left-of-center government, Weimar Republic, to push wages up, because once you depreciate the currency and imported goods go up, the real wages go down, so you have to give them, you have, costs going up. And she says the only, in this picture that it's missing in the two schools is one thing, is that you need for inflation wage resistance. And you need workers to, demand higher wages, and so you need conflict. And why do I bring this up? And I was going to talk about mostly this and Latin American theories of inflation, but I won't have time to do that. I have like 3 minutes, 5 minutes. He's giving me 2 more. My ex-wife says that I'm open to the monologue, so I'm not going to talk about the Latin American, inflation, but I think it's important to discuss this issue of wages and our interpretation of what happened, because one of the important things that we have to do is, reflect of what happened. And if we learn the wrong lessons of what happened, the inflationary crisis, I think we're going to be in significant trouble. I think that there are, within heterodoxy, a significant, lack of understanding of what happened in the last crisis. There has been, for political reasons, a view that if you say that wages, we didn't the panel is austerity, inflation, and conflict. We have austerity, but we didn't during the last crisis. One of the good things of the pandemic is that actually both Trump first and then Biden spent significant amount of money, and they allowed demand to continue. That demand allowed, for example, the demand for cars to continue, and people were buying used cars, and because there was no supply of used cars, the prices went up. So yeah, sure, that's part of the explanation of why some prices went up. Demand was still there. So we didn't have austerity, but we did not have is conflict. And we didn't have much inflation. To tell you the truth, we didn't. 8% is not inflation. I live with 2,000% inflation. So, we didn't have inflation. So we didn't have inflation. We didn't have conflict. We didn't have inflation because we didn't have conflict. But we didn't have austerity too. What we are learning, though, is that we need more austerity, and that that's my fear, and that that it was big, evil corporations that caused inflation, which wasn't. It was shocks and propagation mechanism. We didn't have the propagation mechanism because labor is incredibly weak. So I have 2 little papers on Catalyst and the Review of Keynesian Economics, and you see that the number of strikes didn't go up. We have a little bit of strikes. Nothing happened, in that arena. So I think that that's one of the problematic things. I have in my 2 minutes perhaps, and so I'm going to I want to bolt and say something. And by the way, saying that wages are central to the process of inflation is not blaming workers for inflation, okay? And also I should say the important thing about, inflation is not a problem. Nobody didn't vote for Biden because of inflation. People vote because of their income, how much money they have in their pockets. If wages go above inflation, and he didn't do crap on Palestine and so on and so forth, the results might have been different. That's another discussion, completely different. But my point is, inflation is not necessarily, shut up, Matias, is what the phone is telling me. So that's not the problem. Very briefly about Latin America. I think that also that, in particular in the case of Argentina, more than in Brazil, we are in danger of learning the wrong lessons. And there has been a praise both by heterodox economists in Argentina itself, but in the international press, of the suggestion that Milei's government has been incredibly successful in bringing inflation. And I don't have much time, I'm going to just say this. So inflation in Argentina was high. It was high for a long while. I worked at the Central Bank of Argentina more than a decade ago. At that time, it was high. It was 25%. By the way, Argentina stopped growing in 2011. We have completely stagnated. That's the year I entered the Central Bank of Argentina. So I don't know, but I think I might have caused a problem. We never grew again. So if it's true that, that markets sort of look at what the central bank says, these people are not trustworthy. If they have this guy, so we never grew again. The point is, inflation was about 25%. It's where inflation is heading now. What happened over the very last period before Milei is that we have no reserves, we have no dollars. Like the Germans in 23 had to pay reparations and they had no dollars. And the exchange rate, sort of got out of control. And that's what caused inflation. Milei, when he entered, he depreciated the currency, by 100%. So he doubled the exchange rate. And that accelerated inflation. So inflation went from, and I'll finish with this, went from 12% to 25% per month, okay? And if you put it on an Excel file and do the math, it's like we're talking 290% inflation a year. So it's not just adding up. And he then proceeded to do what? To do two things that you do if you really want to stabilize, and he stabilized. Inflation is 2% a month. We're back to something like 20, 30% a year. So what he did is he held wages and he held exchange rate. So that's it. The fiscal policy that he pursued just caused the recession. So we have a very heterodox stabilization process, but disguised as a very orthodox one, and the orthodoxy that was under attack at the IMF in the mainstream is back resurgent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matias. As you just all heard, Matias is a very important economist. Actually, I myself came to study economics from activist or agitator or whatever, being involved in movements and trying to figure out how does it actually work. And so I entered in a PhD program, which I wasn't planning on finishing, but anyway, here I am. But it's, but Matias's work is like some kind of work I try to always look at to try to understand, what's going on and how these things are working. So thank you very much. The next two speakers are going to be slightly different. They're not academics, thank God. And so first we have Halla, who is the head of the largest union in Iceland.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and thank you for creating this. Yesterday, you were encouraged to argue, which is a good thing to do. And I want to follow this lead and also give an encouragement. And I want to encourage all of you to exercise intellectual generosity. Because we who work outside academia, someone yesterday said in the real world, I don't know how real it is, but I know that we need ideas and we need knowledge. We might not understand all the empirical data or the details of your theoretical framework. Maybe we're not interested in it. But we do understand the reality that we face every day, we try to organize. As a trade unionist, I'm strongly aware that one of our main opponents is orthodox economics. Before we ever even get down to the bargaining table with employers, economists, and not just from academia, the central bank, or the government, but even our own, our labor movement economists, inform us that better wages will cause inflation, dooming everyone to a wage price spiral, insisting that wages will make possible economic stability, that lower wages will make possible economic stability and enhanced competitiveness. The labor movement is an unnatural bug in these economic models, a problem preventing their magical equilibrium mechanisms from doing the work. For years, the Icelandic labor movement was led by economists who would stand in front of a whiteboard and pull out a pen and start doing the maths. And there would be formulas and pluses and minuses and A's and B's and X's and whatever you have. And the result would be, and guess what? The result would be salaries can't be increased. So let us make only so-called moderate demands. And last year, and I should tell you that the Icelandic labor movement is one of the strongest in the world. We have the highest union density, I think, after North Korea. So we're pretty good. And last year, the Icelandic labor movement, led by industrial frontriders, that's the people who sign contracts first and then insist that the rest of us follow, they signed collective agreements with salary increases below inflation, referring the central bank's ideology that inflation and salaries are so deeply connected that if you want inflation down, start with people's incomes. The hope, or to be more precise, the promise to working people was that interest rates would drop almost immediately. This was a year ago. They were 9.25 at the time. And guess what they are now, a year later? A whole year of salary rises below inflation. They're at 8 points. And they just went down by 0.5 the day before yesterday. And in the meantime, 1/4 of households have reached the end of their fixed rate term, resulting in a reality where medium income households in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, people who should have a fair share in the product of their labor, these households struggle economically if their dishwasher breaks down. Because whatever savings they might have been transferred to the banks. In the face of this economic narrative and the social power that backs it, people just get on with it. Somewhat accepting the politics that protect those who own, but transfer the burdens to those who work and those who have housing debts. Basically, all of us who are just exercising the universal human right of having a home. So when I say intellectual generosity, I am desperately calling for ideas and counter-narratives of how to combat this. How can I organize at least my union so that my board and my members understand that the economics ruling their lives are not based on unalterable laws of physics, but on political ideology? How can I encourage them to ask the right questions so that we can move towards a framework that works for working people and for the planet? And I want to give 2 examples of intellectual generosity. One is Clara Mattei. Responding to my invitation to Iceland within minutes and being on a plane a few weeks later to give a talk in our union headquarters in Reykjavik, happy to work around the resources that I had at the time, the resources that I could secure. And not only giving a brilliant talk, but also speaking to press, meeting with academia, and having conversations with anyone who would be bothered to listen. Another is Jamie Galbraith, who has answered my numerous emails where I'm trying to understand inflation, but even more importantly, the politics of inflation. He's always careful in his advice, as he's not the World Bank that goes around and tells everybody that the same solutions work everywhere. But he gives me the right questions to ask, the tools that I need to poke holes in the central bank's dogma. He gives me the words that I can use, sitting against the employer's economists, so that I can shock them by saying, well, you need to be able to think beyond the Phillips curve. If you can think at all. And this is intellectual generosity in praxis. So I'd say get together at conferences, define yourselves, argue about your empirical data, make sure it holds, we need it to hold, and develop your individual theoretical frameworks, but then get out. Share your thoughts, help us understand, and make sense of the reality that we face every day. Teach and learn, we need it, and the world desperately needs it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Bob. He was the promised tax expert, promised by Scott yesterday. So, Bob. Does somebody know the password?
That's a Seinfeld episode right there.
It's password. It's okay. So, you want to get started without it, or you want to start talking about the graph?
It comes right up.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Is there a different login or
Bruno.
switch user?
Password.
It's Jesus' account.
Can you use a different sign-in?
Okay, we can use mine, but we don't have the PowerPoints here.
Oh. It's on the desktop, no?
So some issues. Isn't this the password? This is the password. Now you close your eyes, please. Okay, fingers crossed.
Perfect.
I need to be here, sorry. Perfect. I need this. Sorry.
Bob?
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm not an academic. I've spent my career as a tax lawyer, and I currently work in the federal tax space. I work with an organization called the Patriotic Millionaires, who are wealthy Americans who believe the undertaxation of America's rich is threatening our democracy. And really, I work in the kind of the intersection between tax policy and inequality. I saw this graphic on Twitter a week or so ago, and I wanted to start with it because I think it capsulizes where we've gone in the last 42 years and how threatened our democracy is by the concentration of wealth in America. So you start out in 1982 with this incredibly elite group, the top 0.00001% of Americans. 19 Americans. We currently have 190 million households. So they're the top 1/10 millionth of the population. And they have wealth of $3.1 trillion now, out of 146 trillion. So over 2% of the country's wealth in just these 19 people. 42 years ago, they had under 0.2%. It's more than a tenfold increase. And I think Gabe Zuckman has a linear y-axis for it because it's easier for folks on Twitter and elsewhere to follow. But this really is not a linear progression. It's a geometric progression. So if we continue this trend, if policies in America allowed this trend to continue for another 42 years, we would have these 19 people, adjusted for inflation, maybe 25, owning 20% of the wealth in the country. That's how bad it is. And when you consider the policies that contribute to this extreme concentration of wealth, many contribute to it. Over these last 42 years, we've had an incredible failure in wage policy. The minimum wage is half what it used to be, what it was in 1968. We've had a failure in labor policy. Organized labor has been decimated over the last 4 decades. We've had a failure in antitrust policy. We've had failures in policies related to intellectual property. And those all have contributed to this incredible concentration of wealth at the very, very top. But the last defense against extreme inequality, extreme wealth concentration, the firewall, if you will, is tax policy. And there, the failure has been just atrocious over these last 4 decades. We could argue as a group whether a billionaire is a policy failure. I believe a billionaire is a policy failure. But quarter trillionaires, and we now have 3 of them, are certainly policy failures. And when the country's 3/4 trillionaires, Musk, Bezos, and Zuckerberg, were front and center at the inauguration of a billionaire president, oligarchy is clearly upon us. So how did we get here? We talked about these failed policies, and I want to focus on how the failed tax policy drove this concentration. Anyone's wealth increases by their income, and I don't mean their taxable income or their adjusted gross income, I mean their economic income. Their income reduced by their living expenses and their tax payments. And living expenses are regressive. The poorer you are, the less income you have, the bigger percentage you're paying out in living expenses. If you're working at the minimum wage, or even at double the minimum wage, you're paying out 100% of your income in living expenses. If you're a billionaire, that percentage is much, much lower, even if your living expenses include things like yachts and private jets. That means that to control this concentration of wealth, taxes have to be progressive. And so let's look at the various taxes we have in America, and whether they're progressive, regressive, or kind of flat. Start out with payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare taxes. Very, very clearly regressive taxes. Property taxes at the state and local level are regressive. And in fact, the group that's most burdened by property tax in America are tenants, the folks at the bottom. And that's because property tax rates generally for rental property are much, much higher, often 10 times as high as property tax rates for owner-occupied property. I'm having trouble here because these are reading glasses, and when I look out to the audience, everything's a blur. So property taxes are regressive, and of course, the landlord pays the property tax, but it's passed through in the form of rent. Sales taxes at the state and local level, and in fact, at the federal level, gasoline taxes, which are effectively sales taxes, are steeply regressive. So that leaves us with really 2 categories. Estate taxes, or more broadly, estate and gift and generation skipping taxes, and income taxes. The estate tax is designed to be steeply progressive. The problem is that the system has been so eviscerated by tax avoidance strategies that even billionaires can plan their way out of the estate tax. The estate tax has become an optional tax, and virtually nobody is paying it. So we can put the estate tax aside in this analysis. Let's move to the income tax. At the state level, income tax rates are declining. They're becoming less progressive. And overall, when you take all state taxes only 6 states have progressive tax systems. The other 44 are regressive, and some incredibly regressive. In states like Florida and Texas, the folks in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, are paying 15% or so of their income in state tax. But the folks in the top 1% are paying 2% of their income in state tax. It's incredibly regressive at the state level. And even in those 6 states, New York, California, Connecticut, a couple others, that have overall progressive systems, there's tremendous pressure on their income tax because there's this fear that their rich residents will leave for a state like Florida or Texas that has a 0% income tax rate. So finally, the federal income tax. And on its face, the federal income tax is progressive. You start at 0 rates for those with very low incomes and climb all the way to 37% for those in the top 1%. Now, it used to be a lot more progressive. It used to go all the way to 90%. But it's still very progressive on its face. But there's 3 things that negate that progressivity. The first is preferential rates that apply to certain types of income, especially capital gains, long-term capital gains, and dividends. A much lower rate, a top rate of 20%. And of course, those 2 types of income, dividends and capital gains, the folks at the very top dominate that type of income. The folks at the very top, very top, most of their income is in the form of dividends and capital gains. The second, and this one a lot of people don't see, and it's super important, is that these capital gains are not just taxed at a lower rate. That's actually, I think, the lesser problem. It's that they're only taxed when investment assets are sold. So if you hold an investment asset for, say, 30 years, you've got this tax-free compounding of the gains going on for 30 years. And I've recently run a lot of numbers on this, and it's incredible what you see when you translate this 20% tax after having gains compound for 30 or 40 years, and you translate that into what the effective annual tax rate is. For example, somebody holds an asset for 30 years and it appreciates at 10% per year. That 20% tax at the end of 30 years translates into maybe an 8% per year tax if they were taxed annually. And so this tax system we have doesn't show that. It looks like they're paying 20% when they sell an asset and they have the gain. But really, that tax they're paying, only part of it is economically taxed. The other part is basically interest. It's what they're paying for the privilege of deferring their tax liability. And finally, there's a whole bunch of income, economic income, that just escapes tax entirely. There are many, many categories. The biggest one in America is whatever what was that, 1 minute or 3? Okay, I can do that. Whatever income, whatever gains somebody has at death that haven't been recognized, they go away. They vanish for income tax purposes. So the result we get is a barely progressive income tax up to maybe the beginning of the top 1%, and then it becomes regressive, with those at the very, very top paying very, very little. In fact, when you look at these 19 billionaires, a recent study commissioned by the Treasury Department found that their average tax rate, total taxes, sales tax, property tax, income tax, even their indirect share of corporate taxes, they're paying 1% of their wealth per year. Their wealth is growing at 10% or more per year. Their taxes that are paying are 1% of their wealth. Think how much more wealth you would have if all you paid every year in all your taxes put together was 1% of your wealth. But you don't have that privilege in America. Only the billionaires have that privilege. So the bottom line is that we can't heal our country without a radical change in tax policy. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Bob. Next up is Clara. So Clara wrote a book about how economists invented austerity. So she'll speak a few minutes or not. But before she comes on, I would all of us like us to really give an applause for her coming here and helping, and also to Scott and Bruno for really helping to build this Chase Center. So please, thank you, Clara.
Too many thanks already. I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for you guys to be here, and everyone has accepted so enthusiastically to participate, coming from really far too. I mean, it's a journey to arrive to Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I'm more than ever grateful. Okay, so this was wonderful. I really want to keep it brief. I just want to say, so my own way of being heterodox has been to really try to take very seriously historical political economy. And the reason why I call it historical political economy is because I do think that history, economic history, if done in a way that asks larger questions, and we will have a panel tomorrow on the methods of undertaking economic history and the different views, can help us get clearer on the present day dynamics in a way that really helps us denaturalize a lot of patterns that I think many heterodox economists themselves tend to take for granted, of course, because we do live in our current socioeconomic system. So my historical work has gotten me a couple, I think, of insights that I want to share that can be useful, just as, guiding points. One is on how academic and public debate even defines austerity. And what you see is that the definition that we kind of take for granted is a definition that is definitely self-defeating if we want to challenge austerity, because it's looking at the whole, the aggregate. So the question, how it's usually defined is whether the state spends or not, and whether the state taxes or not. While if you look at it historically and from a political economy perspective, you realize that it has really nothing to do with how much the state spends. It's about where the state spends, and this is very important, right? It's about shifting the resources from the working class to the saving, investing class. So this is why austerity is about curtailment, structural curtailment in social expenditures, housing, education, healthcare, and so forth, while the state is spending lavishly on, well, the military-industrial complex, for example, financing a genocide, as it is spending lavishly on subsidizing and de-risking the private sector, asset managers, the carceral state, and so on and so forth. Of course, the green sector now, and etc. So again, it's really about a choice of where the resources go. And then, of course, it's a choice of who you take the resources from, as Bob explained very clearly. It's about regressive taxation, not whether or not the states. So the definition that we hear, austerity is about budget cuts and tax increases, is just empty. Or better, it's ideological, because it helps us, preserve the sense by which there is a unity in capitalism and how to govern capitalism, which is a falsity. And I think this is something that the heterodox tradition should agree on, is capitalism has nothing to do with the whole and the good of the whole. It's all about conflict, right? Okay, so that's the first issue about the definition and how the different definition can help us see clearer also in terms of how we want to challenge the status quo. The second is about, so again, right, so this whole point is it's not about the state stepping back. It's actually about the state intervening very forcibly to maintain the class balance that is most congenial to capital accumulation. And this is very important because it gets to my second point. Austerity is not a mistake. We can talk about failure, but the question is the failure for whom, right? And ultimately what you realize is that austerity serves its purpose very well. And the purpose is that of stabilizing the pillars of capitalism. Wage relations and private command over investment are not at all to be taken for granted. They're not spontaneous, and it's like, it's the revelation of taking history seriously. We have to denaturalize that. So what you realize is that historically, what austerity has done very well is to maintain the majority in a condition by which they have no option but to go work for a wage, and very often a very low one. And of course, maintaining the protection of the command over investment by the capitalist class. This is the role austerity serves, and it's done it very well by curtailing basically alternatives. When you have to pay your bills and have to pay your taxes and you have to work 3 jobs, of course you don't have time to sit in a room like this and get together, right? And this is why, in a way, the very idea of the CE is revolutionary, because it's about forcing the space to discuss and figure out what to do when austerity capitalism functions exactly to divide us, to make us only preoccupied with, of course, our daily survival. So austerity is not a mistake, and this means that austerity reveals something that is very important, which is the fact that in our economic system, there is a deep conflict between the logic of need and the logic of profit. And this has to be said out loud, because I think everyone who lives in this economy knows it, but the types of ideas we're exposed to, of course, constantly conceal it. Right? So austerity is very clear. Austerity works. It can work. It can work to resolve certain issues like class conflict, of course, right? It does work in shifting the burden on the working class. Now, so it's not a failure in the sense, but it is a failure in the sense that Bob, I think, really meant it, which is it's a failure according to the logic of need. And so this thing about these different logics and which one dominates, of course, was the guiding line of Marx's critique of political economy, but it's something that I think we really need to take seriously in how it operates through austerity policies. So the big question that I think Clara brought to the table, and I conclude, is the question of, can you stabilize capitalism without the sacrifice of the working class? And if you look at history, and then of course if you adopt different methods, you can come to different conclusions, but the method I've adopted, which is the historical method, well, I would say that austerity is ingrained in capitalism. Austerity is in the DNA of capitalism because it is the only way to stabilize a system that ultimately does not work for people. And I think this needs to be explored historically because it allows us to avoid illusions of just like thinking that it's just enough to try to fix it by finding some weird way to, we can try to have the logic of profit somehow compatible with better working conditions of the working class, but it's very hard, right? Because of course it's about a conflict, it's all about political decisions. And so that I think is very important is, again, for economists, heterodox economists, to avoid getting into the economism that is typical of the orthodoxy. Of course, austerity has never worked to solve the budget problem. Austerity is very expensive, as the regressive taxation system shows. It does cause recessions, but guess what? Recessions somehow are good for the existential survival of capitalism because it increases the reserve army of labor. And that ultimately we know is the way to weaken the working class, right? So a recession is ultimately a short-term loss for a longer-term gain, which is that of maintaining the balance of power that is congenial to this type of economic system. So I just wanted to finish maybe by, and this one I'll just read because it's easier. How am I doing with time? Do I have 2 minutes? Okay, good. I didn't want to take much. If I can enter the password of my computer. So this applies also, and I would like to conclude bringing up what Halla was saying, and thank you so much, Halla, for this brilliant intervention, is how ultimately, if you study the history of austerity, this goes combined with the study, of course, the history of how the economic system is justified, right? So austerity is both coercion and consensus building. It's coercion in the way the state actively intervenes to shift resources away from people, those very people that create value. But it's also about how do you justify these economic policies. And this is where, of course, orthodox economics comes in. And if you look at the study of the role of economists, mainstream economists, it has been, of course, of taking us away from the real questions that instead in this center, in the Che, we want to bring back to the table. So this is very clear if we look at, for example, how economists have explained inflation, right? The Phillips curve packages the unpalatable trade-off between profits and unemployment in the more palatable one between inflation and unemployment, right? So from profits and unemployment, we are meant to think about inflation and unemployment. And you see, this is already a really big change because it gives this seemingly innocuous choice of variables achieves some important wins for the system. By hiding what is really at stake, the protection of profits, it focuses our attention on inflation. We're all led to believe that economists are primarily concerned with combating inflation, a phenomenon that especially hurts those who have less purchasing power. Like this, we easily overlook the violent reality of our economy. Without unemployment, there is no smooth investment. This is nowhere more evident than in the concept of the so-called Nairu, that evolved from the Phillips curve, which argues that the economy has a natural rate of unemployment, that any attempt to push unemployment below this level will result in accelerating inflation. This natural rate of unemployment, also styled as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, transforms a pain that is specific to capitalism into one that supposedly is unavoidable. It tells us that unemployment is not a political choice stemming from the economic system we have constructed, but a fact of human affairs stemming from the laws of nature themselves. So we go to the very first point that Clara mentioned, which is economic models and the policies that follow are built in such a way that it's always the workers who have to make sacrifices. For there to be monetary stability, there must be a significant number of people without jobs. If hiring were to exceed what we can define as the natural threshold tolerable by the system, the lives of the employed people wouldn't become easier because it would trigger an inflationary cycle that would erode wages. So we see here, I think it's very important for us to be very clear when we talk about failures and successes, what exactly is the criteria for us to be judging our society? And definitely the economic criteria is not the criteria that is the criteria I think most of us really care about. So I think this is very important to keep in mind, and that's why focusing on austerity can really kind of shed light on the dark aspects of capitalism that everyone feels on one's skin. And I think the role of us as thinkers is also to make it very, very obvious so that people not only feel weakened by the circumstances, but also empowered by the fact that they can see that what they feel has a coherent explanation in theories that can help them move forward and combat this gross injustice that has been perpetuated for centuries. And now, of course, we're seeing the peak of it with the Trump administration and the colonialism over Palestine. Thank you so much.
Does this work? Yes. So what we'll do right now is have a round of questions, and then the panelists will have one more time to speak. Yeah, please, and make sure to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kyle Hayes. I work here at Tulsa Community College. I'm actually an English faculty, so I actually have a humanities question, kind of like a, I guess, critical thinking question. My background is actually creative writing, and I know a lot of people think creative writing is just drunk grad students, reading bad poetry in bars. It is that, but it's also the study of narrative. It's the study of the narratives we walk into, the narratives that we can create, and also how to recognize it, and also the difference between narrative and story. And so I am leading there. The philosopher Mark Fisher said that we are currently living under a capitalist realism in which capitalism has more or less exploited our dreams, our imaginations, to where we can't even imagine the end of capitalism without imagining the end of the world. I would like to also add another quote by Frederick Douglass. He said, "The story of the master never wanted for narrators, the masters, to tell their story, had at call all the talent and genius that wealth and influence could command. They have had their full day in court. Literature, theology, philosophy, law, and learning have come willingly to their service, and if condemned, they have not been condemned unheard. Our part in the cultural understanding, as Douglass said, has been to tell the story of the slave." And so my question is, how do you see heterodoxies fitting in with the narrative of, I guess, economic history, and what's its story now, and how would you define that story now? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Braden Turner, University of Tulsa grad, 2018. I was also an English major, but I have a minor in economics, and I've tried to do some self-education, but I don't know anything, so forgive me. I was very interested in the discussion on Brazil and the fiscal and monetary situation. It's a story I've followed very closely, and especially in comparison with Argentina, and this kind of trap that Brazil is in right now, where they need to grow, but the nominal rate of interest is so high. I mean, equity markets there have been absolutely crushed. And I mean, I think one statement that every capitalist would agree with is you have to spend money to make money, right? So you have to invest to be able to grow, to get out of that deficit trap. Which brings me to my next point here is that I think it's a fundamental principle of heterodoxy is that financial markets are highly ideological. I mean, you can see that in the speculative attacks that have been made on the Brazilian real, and Wall Street hates Lula, I think on a personal level even, and he's stated as much. So in thinking of ways to get out of this trap in which the sovereign debt risk premium is so high, I wanted to get your opinions on modern monetary theory of abolishing sovereign debt issuance and kind of handing this over more to the central bank. Thank you.
Leonardo?
Hi, I'm Leo. I'm a PhD student in economics at UMass Amherst, and I'm also Argentinian, like Matias, and a bit Brazilian too. But I had a question for Costas, and I guess Matias as well, particularly in regards to how trade has been, let's say, switching toward China in Latin America, and what that represents in terms of the hierarchy of currencies. And in particular, how can that be perhaps, let's say, modeled into a policy where inflation can, in a way, perhaps be tamed or redirected in a more sustainable fashion toward, let's say, public projects and so on, but so that the South, let's say, South America, can, in a way, have more autonomous control of its expenditures.
Yes.
Xavier Doolittle. The question I had was, a lot of these issues are obviously really huge on like a national level when you talk about inflation, austerity, and that generally being the point at which these policies do, as well as the international level. I'm someone who's really focused on local and like state work, and it's very difficult for someone who's like a militant on the ground to even think about how to approach any of these issues. They are so beyond the capability of what a small group of people or any one person can do, even with collective action. And I also think about with the specifics of the United States system, with it being so federalized, I think Bob's examples already kind of point out is it works against us with how in a lot of ways how fragmented all that tax policy is, because you can create these little cubby holes basically where people can go and put their money, and that happens internationally too. I know. But I guess wrapping to like a more of a direct question to the panel, if there's like ideas or thoughts of like, is there a place on, especially a municipal or maybe more broadly a regional or state level, we can address these issues of inflation, austerity on like a militant or like political level and organize around? And then, or is it really a question of, is the issue so big that it requires that top-down level? Is this where that, because that was unfortunately my conclusion, is this is something I basically have to abdicate, like personally. Obviously I would be a sport of like, it's hard to imagine what you even organize around with just how huge the powers are. So, thank you.
I'm Brian Turner. Some of you may know I'm working with a group of people to eradicate poverty, and I'm recruiting for people. It's one reason why I'm here. The second thing that bothers me a lot is the impact of AI on our working force. I read somewhere, and I hope I'm not too wrong, that 33 million jobs can be eliminated by 2025. Wait a minute. That's right now. How in the world are we going to go about maintaining people? And these are a lot of high-paid people that are coming out that will be expected to be about the same kind of income that they left the industry in. It's already happening. We get tens of thousands of highly qualified people being laid off, put out on the street, and there's no place they're going to go. And I'll bet you that there's a whole lot of assembly line workers that are not going to be able to be retrained as AI engineers who will also be automated out of a job. So I'd be interested in what people think about that and its impact on inflation as well as austerity and all those kinds of implications, if not outright revolution.
Thank you. A couple of quick observations. The panel's gone a long way from inflation targeting and central banking, but I think it's worthwhile to reflect for a second on why central banks and when central banks first obtained this supposed responsibility. They got it, I think, in the 1970s. And the idea behind that was that they were to control the growth of the money supply. And that idea collapsed quite quickly in the 1980s. And through the 1980s, they were supposed to be fighting inflation by maintaining unemployment along the Phillips curve or in the natural rate of unemployment. And that idea collapsed in the 1990s in the United States when the unemployment rate fell, but inflation rate didn't rise. And so then in around the 2000s, we got inflation targeting simply by raising the interest rate and affecting, I don't know, expectations, some psychological story, which at least had the idea that if you raised interest rates, that this would slow the economy. And Jerome Powell started doing this a few years ago and had absolutely no success in slowing the economy, although the inflation rate went down anyway. And now we're hearing the press saying it was a soft landing, as though the Federal Reserve in the United States has some kind of magical power that has absolutely no connection to anything that actually operates in the economy. And this really reflects the decline of the interest rate as a force on the economy and reflects the fact that we've been basically taken in by mysticism. And if you want to have a serious inflation policy, you have to move it out of the central bank. It has really, in the current world, practically nothing to do. Maybe in some countries where it affects the exchange rate, that's a separate issue. But that's a very minor consideration in large economies. So that's the first point. Second point has to do with this distribution of income and wealth issue. And I think that you made this point. This is a capital is not a homogeneous entity, and the current concentration of wealth, where, I don't know, 40% of the valuation of the S&P 500 is 10 companies, all of which are in the techno-feudal sphere, and the young men who were with Trump on the 21st of January, these multi-billionaires represent a sector which has sucked a capital valuation out of the rest of the economy. And what we can recognize is that that is a very artificial and very fragile concept of wealth, which can go away in a flash. And in fact, a few days ago, when the Chinese released DeepSeek into the $500 billion of that fabulous capital wealth went away in 12 hours. And who knows when the next shock of that kind will have a similar effect. So you're quite right to worry about the jobs, but I suspect that going, a small consolation when the jobs disappear is that all of these billionaires, well, they won't be homeless and out on the street, but they will diminish, their significance in our society will diminish just as it rose, or at least we can hope that much. Thank you.
Di Riccardi.
We won't be able to reply. So we won't be able to reply. There is an inflation of questions.
I know.
And
This is
we're
the last
very
one.
austere in our replies. And there is a conflict. I'm just saying.
Clara Mattei was effective as ever, but since these things are useful if there is debate, I would like to raise 3 points on 3 key issues that you raised. Austerity is in the DNA of capitalism, needs versus profits, and workers are those who have to sacrifice. Half-jokingly, I call my objections orthodox Marxist objections. The first is, it's not sure that austerity is in the DNA of capitalism, because if you may have a raise of the real wage higher than the productive power of labor, and the pie for the capitalist grows up, is relative surplus value extraction. So that would not be revolution. It could be, it could exist. Second, about the needs. Well, Marx typically says that needs are more and more satisfied relatively to the other modes of production in capitalism. Third, I'm not saying there are no distributional issues. Third, here the point should be raised by Galbraith, the father. Needs are induced. And about workers and sacrifice, and I close with this, the point is that very much it seems that these arguments are framed with 2 subjects in mind. On one side, capital, and on the other, people, 90.9%. Well, that's not my framework. I have classes, and there are capital, working class, and a lot of other classes in between. So the analysis should be more specified in my view.
Thank you. Clara, do you want to come up here and answer whatever you like? No,
We were going to be... Okay. I don't know.
So those were a lot of questions. I'm going to try to address most of them together. I'm going to start with the narrative one. And I think this is something that Halla mentioned very well. So I have a professor, Giba, from my master's, Gilberto de Lima, which is a reference for me. And he taught me when I was there at the University of São Paulo that every model is logically consistent. So if you assume that their hypotheses are true, and if you follow the logic of the model, it will close and will make sense. And of course, every model is logically consistent. So if you don't think about and if you don't question what's going on behind those assumptions, it makes sense. And then people will teach you, and in neoclassical models we learn, well, if you do this, you get that, and then yeah, it makes sense. Maybe if you follow within the model, it makes sense. So that's the narrative which I think will make sense within any model. And that's the narrative we have on the mainstream discourse, and that convinces people and etc. What doesn't convince? Well, first, if that doesn't meet reality. So if you learn the model and then you look at reality and it's not making sense, so you say, well, this doesn't explain the story. How do I match, right, this narrative? And of course, if that doesn't make sense for you, so if you realize that the narrative saying, well, this is workers are going to have to pay the bill and not have wage increases, you say, well, I don't like it. I don't think it makes sense. It has to have an alternative. And I think this is what brings to heterodoxy and the questions that at least when I came to heterodoxy, I asked was this. So this, indeed, that can be the only option. Like, this is not fair in the end. So I think this is one side. And the other side is reality. And when it doesn't meet reality, I think it's the point. And then to that, I think that going to the issue of Brazil, and then connecting to the model itself. I think that first I'm going to connect that actually to the point of rising interest rates and not necessarily decreasing growth and etc. Just a quick comment, I'm not going to go in details into that, but I think that what re-emphasized on my presentation is exactly the link. So if we are controlling inflation, it's because we are controlling the conflict. And we need to understand how we are controlling the conflict. So if interest rates are capable of controlling inflation, it's because it's controlling the conflict. If interest rates is going up and if nothing's going on with inflation, it's because there's something else controlling. It doesn't mean that necessarily going up with the interest rates will solve the conflict, and that's why we have to understand how interest rates affect income distribution and then itself the conflict, which will, of course, have impact on the rest of the economy and growth and etc. So in that sense, coming then now to Brazil, I think that it's indeed very hard. The reasons why we have so high interest rates are complex. I wrote with a colleague from UFMG a piece at Phenomenal World, which is called Why So High? Interest Rate in Brazil, that tries to explain why we have that's the case. And it's a very specific setting on how we have our basic rate of interest connected to government bonds. But anyway, we do have high interest rates, and indeed we need to grow. And I think that's the issue, which for me is challenging Brazil at this point, because it is, again, the narrative. So if you follow in the narrative, well, we need to grow, but we have high interest rates. So the government itself, the Ministry of Finance, of the Economy, the government approved a rule, which is a surplus-led rule that guarantees fiscal surplus because we need to stabilize the debt because we have high interest rates, etc. But again, this will lead to lower growth. So the result is we have a state that basically, and then going to what Clara's point mentioned on austerity and where we spend, so we have a state that spends to avoid poverty. That's what the Brazilian government does. So we have Bolsa Família, great program, and it's just avoiding extreme poverty. The rest is led to the market. And you ask the Ministry of Finance, and I did once ask him, like, how does your industrial policy is gonna work if you have a rule that's basically guaranteeing surplus? You don't have space to spend, so what's your industrial policy? And he answered, it's guarantee the economic conditions for the private market to invest. And I think this is indeed a trap. But again, how do we get out of this trap with such high interest rates? It is hard, and I think we have to challenge from back then and then have big reforms in the economy. MMT, I don't believe it works because, again, we are a developing economy. We can print reais. People don't want reais. I'm sure most of you here don't want reais. I can give you Brazilian notes. You're going to change it, because what are you going to do with that? So I don't think MMT is the solution. I don't think it works for a developing economy. Yeah, so I think that the solutions are in the reform in the system. And I think, of course, I don't have the answers, but I think that's where the discussion should go to. Yeah, I'm going to end now because I spoke a lot. Sorry.
I mentioned that inflation is, in my judgment, a matter of aggregate demand and aggregate supply and the problems of supply. The facilitator is the central bank. Unless the central bank increases the money that's available, it's not going to happen. That's why I focus on the central bank. So the creation of fiat money, which has been extraordinary. I mean, I really want you to understand how extraordinary it is. The balance sheet of the European Central Bank in June 2022 was almost 9 trillion euros. 9 trillion euros is a lot of euros. 60% of the GDP of the EU. There's never been a time like that. And despite the compression, it's at 6.4 now in January, last month. 6.4 trillion euros. So that's the kind of thing. It's the facilitator, right? That's why we look at the central bank. And it's the same with compressing inflation. It starts with the central bank, which is why it's important to understand how it does it and the narrowness of options. From the perspective of workers, which has been discussed, I think it's very strong and very clear. Inflation is a problem because your wages don't rise as fast as the general price level. So basically inflation, other things equal, represents a loss of real income, loss of real wage. And what happens there, as Keynes explained brilliantly, long before anybody else, is that this income is transferred from the pockets of workers to the boxes of capitalists. The explosion of profits in the United States and elsewhere during this period of inflation is because of that. I mean, it's keep wages down and then increase profits. And they've got nothing to do with taking risk, with investing, with nothing. It's just an income transfer. So the strongest argument at that level for working people is that this kind of policy represents, it's basically robbery, right? Taking it out of the pocket of working people and giving it to corporations. What do you propose then against that? What's the argument against that? It seems to me fairly straightforward. First of all, wages must match inflation. It's not working people's fault that it's happening. So wages must follow the rate of inflation, so real wages should stay where they are. Second, price controls. Price controls so that corporates cannot play the game of raising their own prices and making extra profits from workers and from smaller enterprises, incidentally. Because you can play the same game with smaller and medium enterprises who cannot raise their prices the same way as the big monopolists do. And the key argument right now is aggregate supply restructuring. That's the argument right now. The supply side doesn't work. This is the most monopolized economy among the developed ones. It's controlled by big business. Manifestly doesn't work. Productivity doesn't rise, particularly. I mean, all these stories about productivity miracle in the United States, what figures are these people looking at? You know, so to deal with inflation, longer term, controls and intervention on the supply side. These are the radical arguments. In other words, rebalance production in favor of workers and against capital, and make for rising income levels for everybody in that way. I mean, not the big business, but I mean, the large numbers of people. Now, the question on the international thing. I wanted to avoid the international dimension, but it cannot be avoided. I just want to stress one key thing here. Fiat money expanding the way it has done is a unique period in the history of capitalism. This is a unique time in the history of capitalism. The United States has enjoyed an exorbitant privilege, as we all know. its money since the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971-73 has become world money. And that has meant a number of things for US capital. It has benefited US capital, not necessarily US workers. It has allowed US capital to keep the real wages down and take advantage of the productivity growth in Asia. Essentially, that's what's been happening. Very low productivity growth in the United States. American capitalism doesn't work, but productivity growth in India, in South Korea, in China primarily, and cheap goods come in. So you can maintain that policy for a very long period of time, except that the financial side malfunctions, financialization at the same time. So in the early period, until the late 70s, this created problems on the foreign exchange side for the United States. The way they tried to deal with it was through the Louvre Agreement and the Plaza Accord. I don't know, some of you might remember those. They didn't quite work out. In other words, what they tried to do was to control the dollar exchange rate against the yen. It didn't quite work out the way they wanted, and then they let it be. And the way it worked out was through global capital flows. They liberalized capital flows. And they sucked capital in from across the world. So the United States in the following period, the supply side doesn't work particularly well. What the country does is it cannot export. It presents current account deficits, huge current account deficits. It can finance them by creating dollars and by sucking in money from abroad to buy the dollars, to buy the instruments through which you get access to the dollar. This game is coming to an end. Trump represents the end of this game. And the reason why it's coming to an end is because, partly connected to the central bank story that I told you before. You understand, that's the domestic side. Trump wants to change it. I don't know how he's going to do it. I don't think he does. He's talking about tariffs. He's using them as a weapon. He wants to rebalance trading. He's not talking about capital controls, to which I'm coming for a minute. He's not talking about capital. He's avoiding capital controls. So what he wants, it seems, is somehow to force tariffs on foreigners, rebalance the deficit, but keep the dollar where it is. Keep the dollar as the reference currency. I don't think he will succeed. There will be all kinds of tribulations, but that's what you're in for in this country. That's basically what's happening, because the previous period is at an end. And where do the Brazils go? I teach a lot of students at SOAS from developing countries, and I teach them international finance. The bottom line is, when you teach them international finance, the bottom line is the system is stacked up against you. That's basically what it is. The system is stacked up against you. They all want to find a way of dealing with it. I can't help you, because the system is stacked up against you. You're done for. You understand? Everything works against you, basically. So if you're the finance minister of Mozambique, and I've taught him, right? If you're the finance minister of Mozambique, your options are very few and far between. You understand? Because you're asking me, what can I do? There's nothing you can do, mate, because you're done for, right? So what is possible right now? I'll tell you what you should be thinking of then, and that might hold for Brazil. You need capital controls. Whether you need them the euro or de facto is up to your own finance minister, right? De facto is better than the euro because you avoid the American interventions. But you need capital controls of some sort. You need to stop the financiers messing up your exchange rate, right? So you need capital controls, and that is for sure. You need then somehow discussions with others in the context of Latin America, Brazil and Argentina, but when will we see that? But anyway, Brazil, to discuss creating some variant, some version of commonly used means of payment. The BRICS are talking about it. Latin America isn't talking about it. It's inevitable that you need it. The form they will take today cannot be what Keynes proposed many, many years ago, but that's what we need to be talking about. And the last thing that you need to be discussing when it comes to this is, of course, once again, take the central bank out of it. No central bank independence. I mean, the point made previously is absolutely right. No central bank independence. Take the central bank out of it. Stop the central bank from defending the financial interest domestically and rebalance the aggregate supply. Rethink of how supply will be reorganized. Shift production in favor of labor and against capital. Think of what kind of economy meets popular needs and begin to work in this way. Stop thinking, in other words, of I will grow through exports. Trump will not allow you to. That is the reality from now on. That's what we better all of us better get used to. Thanks.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, yes, I'm going to try to be fast. But if you lose time, yes. So I'm going to try to, first of all, I want to say something about the narrative, but it's really about what Halla was saying, because she was talking about the narrative, and I take very seriously what you were saying. And I always ask, when I teach macroeconomics, and the first question I ask kids is, whether inflation or unemployment is more important, and more often than not, it's inflation. Very rarely unemployment, is the most, unless we're in the middle of a recession. I've been teaching it for 30 years, so we're in the middle of a recession, somebody may say unemployment, but it's not the normal thing, it's inflation. But then you ask them, why is inflation a problem? And obviously one that will come is, well, my income is coming down. Costas gave us the solution, is what I said. So, I'm very unclear, and so my narrative wasn't clear. What I said is, the fact that we make inflation the main problem of macroeconomics, and that we accept that when for most people, if the wages are going up, it's income that matters, no inflation, shouldn't be sort of an issue. Then they try to find another explanation. No, perhaps if we have too much inflation, we don't grow. Well, it turns out that the evidence on that, by the World Bank, not my evidence, the evidence that the World Bank gives you on that, it's that inflation below 40% a year has no impact on growth. So you have to have very, very high inflation in order to have some problem. So the first thing is that what I was trying to say is this, look at this. Inflation is good. We shouldn't be afraid of inflation. Inflation is good. Who says that inflation of 2% is a problem? The inflation targeting. What Jamie asked us to think about, why do we even talk about 2% inflation as the sort of nirvana of the economy? Why not 5, 6, 8? Can anybody tell me what's the difference between 8% and 6% inflation? And they don't know the difference between their asses and their elbows. Pardon my French. Because there is none. They don't know it because there is none. So the narrative is, we want some inflation is good. My grandpa, used to be from, inflation was associated to good times and deflation was associated to bad times. That was essentially what it meant, and we have to go to something like that. I'm going to try to respond to, some of the questions in one thing, and I'm going to say slightly different things that both Clara and Costas said in the previous interventions, about Brazil and Argentina. So I do think that Brazil, so my standard sort of thing on this, I've been saying this for years now because it's been true. Argentina doesn't grow because it can't. Brazil doesn't grow because it doesn't want to. So Brazil can do MMT at this moment. So I have no problem with fiscal activism in Brazil. There is no limitation on the ability other than the fact that the Workers' Party passed itself a rule that forbids the party to actually spend money. But other than that, there's no reason why we are not. So you may very well say, okay, but if you don't do the fiscal adjustment, financial markets. Clara had the graph. If you looked at the graph, she's saying interest rate is too high. Well, it was too high in 2007. It was the same height, and we were growing. And it was even higher before that, and we were growing. Why? Because the interest rate, if you're spending money, you're increasing wages. Brazil was increasing wages. One important thing that Lula did is a policy of increasing the minimum wage consistently. The economy was growing. So in financial markets, nothing happened. Brazilian risk is very low. The MB of JP Morgan is 200%. The Argentinian that came really down is at about 1,000. So 5 times more than the Brazilian one. Argentina cannot because Argentina doesn't have reserves. So what Brazil has is $360 billion in the central bank. Argentina has negative reserves once we pay to the people that we need. Argentina does have capital controls. What do you do with capital controls without reserves? Nothing. You can't do a thing. And so I am for capital controls. I do believe that there are limitations to MMT, so I'm not disagreeing with you guys on that. But I think in this particular case, there's a lot that can be done in Brazil. And, and I'm sorry to say in the case of Argentina, it's very problematic because one thing that I think we should have learned from the collapse of this system that, Costas is telling you, is we're at the border of this collapse. And I told you it's, an important, and Ricardo said this is a crisis. And we're in the middle of, rethinking all of these things. And we have to, rethink. One of the lessons is you can look around. China, not any little country, China is sitting on $3.2, I think, trillion of reserves. China is holding dollars. What Trump has the dollar, the mighty dollar. What we'll do with that, it's another story. But China needs to have $3.2 trillion, in its reserves. Every single country in the world that manages the exchange rate, and you have to manage your nominal exchange rate, has reserves. So the countries that do not have reserves, the Venezuelas, the countries that have been, because the United States has imposed, or because we're stupid and mismanage our economy, doesn't matter what's the reason, those are the ones in crisis. And by the way, that says another thing. The Fed has an incredible global power. When the Fed hikes the rate as they did, everybody is forced to hike the rate. So that's the meaning of hegemony. So what we left out in the discussion today, and I'll shut up with this, is geopolitics. And the left and the heterodox have to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you for this brilliant conversation. So I'm going to be really brief because I know what's standing between you and lunch is me, Bob, and Clara. But I think the conversation on narratives is really important, and I would love to see a group of creative writers sitting down and thinking about narratives. And they have to be compelling. Because now we live in a world where, even if I would ask my membership, they would say, price control bad, capital control bad, independent central bank great, because people believe it. That's the only thing they've been taught. So I want to mention briefly that I'm also a trustee of the New Economics Foundation in the UK, which is a think tank there. And we are now designing a project which has the working title, The Psychology of Austerity, where we're going to try to understand that. I don't know how we're going to do it, so if anyone has any ideas, find me in the break and share with me. We're going to try to understand why normal working people are so willing to accept all these narratives. Why they're so willing to say, yeah, of course we need cuts. Of course we need high interest rates. Of course we need to get the inflation down. And they just get on with it. Because we want them to stop getting on with it. That's the only way to change these things. We can stand here and we can intellectualize all we want about it, but if we don't get people with us, we're never gonna move forward. We're never gonna make any changes. So, any thoughts on that? Find me and tell me and share with me. Thank you.
I'll try to be brief as well. I only have one question that I'm going to try to answer, and that was the question on AI, and I'm going to broaden it to automation in general. And I think it's just a classic example of a narrative being fed to the American public by the billionaires and their media outlets, where we're told, oh, half the jobs in America are going to be automated out of existence. And by the same narrative, conservative pundits you'll hear argue that these fast food workers fighting for a living wage are cutting their own throats because they're going to accelerate automation and then they're going to lose their jobs entirely. And they want everybody to envision this dystopia where everybody's cutting their own wage demands because they want to get one of those few jobs that are left. But here's the alternative narrative. Not that automation is going to eliminate half the jobs, but automation is going to reduce the work week from 40 hours to 20 hours with the same pay for the 20 hours that you used to get for 40 hours. Automation should be a good thing. It should make things better for all of us. So again, that's the way I look at it. We should not be looking at automation as a threat. It should be a good thing.
Yeah, the issue is always in what economic system does automation develop and, in a way, advance, right? And ultimately, in the way it's developed and advanced in this economic system is, of course, to increase the rate of profit and clearly to the detriment of the working classes. So definitely the point is that an alternative to capitalism wouldn't mean less technological advancement, but it would mean technological advancement perhaps that can directly fulfill people's needs, for example, to work less, rather than have to be compatible with the logic of profit that definitely has the tendency to have people work more and for lower wages, right? So again, I think the importance of saying this is an obvious thing that I think all the heterodox economics would agree with is how do you technology is not at all neutral, it's embedded in the socioeconomic system we're in, so it serves different purposes according to the logic of the system we're in, and that's, I think, very important. But I agree that in principle, technology is not necessarily only attached to capitalist development. We have to go to lunch, so I just wanted to say one thing, which is, now I even forgot it. Yes, I mean, of course, the point is that austerity has also central bank independence is a very big element of austerity because I tried to argue austerity is also about de-democratizing the sphere of economic decisions. And so removing people from economic decisions is a key element of how austerity thrives and imposes itself. And that's why then ultimately, as my mentor Duncan Foley would put it, inflation targeting is really rate of exploitation targeting. And you can only do this if the rate of exploitation targeting is, of course, a decision that does not come from the people who would obviously be opposed to it. Just quickly on one point, I can't address all the points, just one point that Ricardo raised. I think when I say the austerity is in the DNA of capitalism, I think the approach is to look at it historically, and what I'm trying to do now is I developed the historical work on the 20s, but if you look at the golden age, and as Carolina was pointing out, the golden age was the golden age for very few hegemonic countries in the north of the globe, but still, even there, what's interesting, and that's this project I'm hoping to actually take on seriously after the conference is over, is that ultimately also in the golden age of capitalism, in a moment in which, of course, the productivity of labor was higher, so in a way compatible with higher wages, the reality is that the inflationary pressures as a way to ultimately limit the possibility of redistributive measures was constantly an obsession of economists in power, right? So the exchange rate, the inflationary pressures, all of these limits that ultimately were in a way mirroring, I think, what are deep political limits of our system, because in fact, our system is not compatible with a living wage for everyone. If we did have a living wage for everyone, no one would go to work for a wage and get exploited, which is the foundation of value production in this economic system. So we see that we really need to rethink, you can't have it all. That was Kalexi telling Keynes, right? Keynes, it's great that you think that we could have just full employment and be all happy. The reality is that if we were in full employment, we wouldn't be in capitalism. And this is a point, like there's clear political limits of what is feasible in terms of social redistribution for people under this economic system. And I think this is something that has to be said very clearly, because it is in this way that we can then maybe start thinking actively about how do we get out of here rather than try to fix ultimately a system that I believe is deeply rotten and because of its very logic. Okay, that's it, sorry.